Lord Vader. You may take Captain Solo to Jabba the Hutt after I have Skywalker.
He's no good to me dead.
Greetings, my fellow Mighty Mandos, Mevar Tigar. Welcome to the 7th action-packed episode of Mandovision, Nargai Tom. And thank you so much for checking out this small, independent Star Wars podcast. We are going back into Season 1 of The Mandalorian on Disney Plus and re-examining and re-reviewing each episode as we work our way towards the debut of Season 2 of The Mandalorian on October 30th. It's very exciting, very good stuff. We can't wait for the Season 2 of The Mandalorian. Before we get into this episode further, please make sure you are following us on social media at Mando_Vision on Twitter and Instagram. Make sure you are liking the show, subscribing to the show, sharing it with all your friends and family, and letting them know that we're doing a pretty darn good job of covering The Mandalorian and all things Star Wars here on the Mandovision podcast. All right, so this week, what we have for you today is, initially I took a bit of a pause in the recapping of each episode of The Mandalorian because after the Gunslinger episode, particularly the end of the Gunslinger episode with the cape and the boots and the illusion, the hint of another Mandalorian, a Mandalorian that perhaps we had just seen, not just seen, we had thought we had last seen on Tatooine, stoked the fan fires that perhaps this was the imminent return of Boba Fett to the main Star Wars canon after his, inglorious demise at the end of at the beginning of Return of the Jedi, as he was dispatched by a gaffy stick from Han Solo to the back. Why I did this episode, why I thought it was important, was because for fans like me, for fans my age, who grew up with what is now considered old canon, to be considered, you'll see it now on the books. It'll have that gold banner on the top. It says Legends, Star Wars Legends. At one point, that was our main continuity. The Star Wars Expanded Universe continuity that was that existed in comic books, in movies, and role-playing games, and video games, prior to Disney's acquisition of Lucasfilm. And for a lot of us fans who, when we, long before the prequels came out, long before the special editions came out, all we had were the Star Wars comic books and novels and again, video game materials. This was the only way the Star Wars universe was surviving to us dedicated fans while there was no new films or TV shows or any of that stuff, long before the TV shows and definitely before the new batch of movies that were coming out. So I thought it was important to do this episode that is titled The Boba Fett Debate, because, again, for fans like myself who are old, who grew up with Star Wars as an intricate part of our childhood, I think for a lot of us, one of the main reasons why we were so interested in the Mandalorian TV series, as those first images were coming out, as we were getting excited for the show to drop as the first thing on Disney Plus, this new streaming channel, and the Mandalorian, this mysterious, exciting a race of beings and characters from the Star Wars universe would be the linchpin of Disney Plus, the way to kick off this whole new service that Disney was doing. And we were finally going to get to explore something that, again, was mysterious and unknown, and just rumors and whispers and things like, this is what Mandalorians are, and this is what Mandalorians are. And again, for people my age, we came from the expanded universe. We came from old canon that no longer counted. And in that old canon, Boba Fett was our cultural icon for what a Mandalorian was at that point in Star Wars mythology. He was what a Mandalorian look like, and to the best of our knowledge, he was the best representation of the Mandalorian people. Well, it turns out that's not necessarily the case. As you know, if I've been encouraging people for a long time now on this podcast, Mandovision, and on my other podcast, the Tomcast podcast, watching Star Wars: The Clone Wars, watching Star Wars Rebels, really expands the mythology of these people, of their culture, of their history. But the big delineation point is that after Disney acquired Lucasfilm, the old canon went away, and that's why the Clone Wars and Star Wars Rebels are so important to not only the Mandalorian, but to Boba Fett himself, and who and what we think he is, and what he supposedly represents. Again, for people my age, this is a little complicated because we have two sets of Star Wars mythology we have to juggle. The one that counts, but the one that the one that no longer counts is the one that we probably remember the most. The one that does count is the one that maybe we kind of slept on because we weren't watching Star Wars: The Clone Wars, and we weren't watching Star Wars Rebels. So there's a little bit of maybe misunderstanding around Boba Fett. And what this episode of the podcast was designed to do initially was to help provide a little clarity into Boba Fett's status prior to Disney, and then post his status with Disney, which post Disney, we don't know much about the whereabouts of Boba Fett. Which is why, again, for a person my age who grew up with that expanded universe mythology, it was a bit of a kick in the nuts to have these amazing Boba Fett stories taken away from us. His connection to the Mandalorian people taken away from us. The great I've mentioned before the great works of Karen Traviss in defining and expanding and exploring the Mandalorian culture, and Boba Fett's initially loose connection to them, and how he becomes a sort of adopted child of the Mandalorian people, because he starts off as sort of a wayward Mandalorian. And his reintegration to their society, his eventual elevation to the title of Mandalore, the king, the leader of all of the Mandalorian clans, all that stuff is phenomenally well done, well executed, well written. It's top-notch material, but it was brushed to the side with Disney's acquisition of Star Wars, and they're wanting to clear the decks for new series and new explorations of the characters and things of this nature. And I explain this, I document this, I talked more about this in a little bit more detail in the episode you're about to listen to. Again, if you're a new Star Wars fan, if all you know is the Clone Wars and Rebels and the films, you're good to go. You don't have to worry about anything to do with Boba Fett other than he's a guy who was wearing Mandalorian armor. And I guess that's the point of this episode is to tell us old fans, us old folks, who thought Boba Fett was a Mandalorian, not so fast, my friends. Boba Fett not necessarily a Mandalorian, at least not in the sense that we are becoming accustomed to through the new continuity, through the new canon that is The Mandalorian on Disney+. So I want you guys to listen to this episode. It's a quick one. It's really, really fast. And I'll catch you guys up on the other end, guys and gals, I should say. I'm trying to get better about that, not genderizing everything that I say. I hope everyone listens to the episode. Again, it's quick, it's fast, but I think I make a pretty good presentation of the facts as far as old canon, new canon, and where Boba Fett kind of falls in the middle of it, and why the Mandalorian series is so rife with potential to explore this character in new ways that we hadn't thought of before. All right, so I'm going to plug the episode in now. I will not interrupt this episode at all. I will just catch up with everybody on the other side. All right, so strap on your buckets. Here we go, the Boba Fett debate. Oh, and by the way, another episode recorded during December, Christmas time. Christmas music will play. That's just how it is. That's how we roll on the Tomcast Popcast, and probably how we're going to roll on Mandovision too, once we get into the holiday season. So again, strap on your buckets. Here we go.
Captain Solo in the cargo hold.
What'd you bring your dad? here for?
He's cool. He's into the whole gaming culture.
Nice poster. Oh, what, like you a big fan of the Fett?
No. He's always more of a Star Wars guy.
Star Wars guy. Who is this man?
Oh, hello, Popheads. Happy holidays. Merry Christmas. Welcome to issue 61 of 3BZine Presents the Tomcast Popcast, also known as Popcast. I am your loving Yuletide host. My name is Tom. Please follow the show on the social medias at Tomcast_Popcast on Twitter and at the Tomcast_Popcast on Instagram. You can email the show at tomcastpopcast@gmail.com. And finally, you can join Pophead Nation at patreon.com/TomcastPopcast, where you can join Pophead Nation for as little as $1 a month. Special thanks to our current Patreons, the Aspen Hill Chody and the Squidmaster General Brian Broussard. Finally, please subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts or whatever platform it is that you listen to our excellent show on. And, give us a 5-star review if you're feeling up for it. So I apologize. My exuberance that I normally have on this podcast is a little tempered down, a little tempered tonight, if you will. It's late. I'm doing this at 10 o'clock at night. My wife is in the next room trying to sleep, so I cannot rant and rave at the volumes that I am normally accustomed to ranting and raving at. But we're going to do the best we can. I wanted to get this show out to you guys. Life gets in the way sometimes. It's final week has kicked off at San Diego State, so things are a little hectic, and I had all kinds of technical problems getting this episode even off the ground. I tried to record it 6 hours ago, but the goddamn GarageBand program was giving me all kinds of problems. So I slapped it across the face, and we finally got this son of a bitch to work correctly. And we're going to talk about what I kind of illuminated, or what I kind of hinted at in the tail end of last week's Mandalorian review. We need to have a conversation about Boba Fett. And for some folks, it's going to be a hard conversation. For me, it's going to be a hard conversation. But it is vital that we have this conversation. All right, so that's what we're going to do today. This is the supplemental Boba Fett debate episode. All right, so where to begin? I guess I'll just cut to the chase right off the bat. Despite what you all think you may know, I'm here to break unfortunate news that just because you think that Boba Fett is the reason why you're so interested and invested in The Mandalorian, technically you are wrong. Boba Fett is not Mandalorian. But he was at one point. And I'd like to... That's basically what this show's about. This is me explaining the lunacy of Star Wars continuity and canon. And so yeah, we're gonna deep dive on some nerdy things. But hopefully through these nerdy things you get a better appreciation and understanding of where The Mandalorian as a show may go, and a better understanding of Boba Fett as a character on his own as well. So I hope to be able to provide a little illumination in that front. And if not, we can just sing Christmas songs. It's okay. It's December 10th. We'll just sing Christmas carols with each other. Now, fuck it. Let's talk about Star Wars. All right. Let's get into it. Here we go. So to start this journey, we have to go a little bit back in time. to that dark era between 1984 and 1999, basically, when Star Wars wasn't a thing anymore, and those of us who were the dedicated, the true believers that Star Wars was still the way. We lived with comic books and graphic novels and role playing game items. I'm sorry, I can't think of the name. Role playing game supplements, basically, that provided more story, more illumination on the galaxy far, far away that we all loved so much. And within the confines of that expanded Star Wars universe, we got to know a little bit more about the mystery man Boba Fett. Of particular interest was the Dark Horse comic series Dark Empire, which showed Boba Fett had escaped from the Sarlacc pit and was still after Han Solo after all this time. And that was one of the things that kind of fired the imagination of the fan base. It was like, oh my God, wait a second. This expanded universe is going to do all kinds of cool stuff. So Dark Horse Comics, when they kicked that series off, and I think that was 91 or 92, really got people excited because they brought back a fan favorite character who, I mean, let's be honest, Boba Fett is the reason why we're interested in The Mandalorian. But all things considered, in the original trilogy, in episodes 4, 5, and 6, Boba Fett was on screen for less than 5 minutes, and I think he spoke less than a dozen words. So, it's all about the look and the way the lines were delivered. And that's what got everybody excited. So we were a little bummed when our Man of Mystery was so easily dispatched in Return of the Jedi. So seeing him brought back to the pages of the Dark Horse comic was invigorating. And there would be a slow exploration of Boba Fett in this time period where there were no new movies. And yeah, we were definitely given the portrayal that he was a Mandalorian. Like that was the context for the character's history. And we started to get, again, they kept it mysterious. They didn't give us tons of details. They didn't go into a full explanation of anything. They didn't go into full origin stories or anything like that. And very famously, one of his most famous stories in this period was Boba Fett tracking down a character named Jodocast who had been impersonating him and leading people to believe false origins for Boba Fett. So Boba Fett tracks down Jodocast and eventually kills him. Again, Jodocast is a character wearing very similar armor to Boba Fett, and it helped kind of clear the decks from some of the history that had popped up in the Star Wars comic strips and the late run of the Marvel comics and things like that. So it helped keep the mystery of the Mandalores and Boba Fett intact. Then something happened. George Lucas announced the prequel trilogy, which we were all excited about because I think the first thing on all of our minds who were invested in Star Wars and were paying attention was the Clone Wars, what Obi-Wan had referenced to Luke Skywalker in his little hut in Tatooine. And that, Luke believed his father to be a navigator on a spice freighter. And Obi-Wan's like, that's not what really happened. That's what your uncle told you. And we find out that Anakin Skywalker was a great warrior in the Clone Wars. What the fuck does that mean? I mean, that's one of those mysteries that's embedded in the first Star Wars movies where you're like, wait, tell me more about this. I want to know more about this. But we didn't know more about this. But through, whether it was short stories in the Star Wars fan magazines or whether it was through the role-playing game supplemental materials, a lot of fans became clued in that the Mandalorians were part of the Clone Wars, were a big part of this, at least in this expanded universe kind of sense. Like this was material not from George Lucas directly, but this was people who had Star Wars licenses attempting to fill in some blanks to a certain extent. Like they couldn't do deep dives on past history of characters. You couldn't really talk about that period. You could allude to it. And one of the things that happened was in the Star Wars role-playing game, they alluded to the fact that the Clone Wars was a conflict between the Jedi and the Mandalorians. So, disappointment may be too strong of a word, but people were a little upset that the Mandalorians did not play a bigger part in what ended up being Attack of the Clones. Lucas opted to do a story that involved the Mandalorians. That they were definitely a key ingredient to the Clone War recipe in a sense, and I'm going to explain that too. I got to be careful here because there's a lot that's intertwined, and we got to kind of pull some threads to unwrap some of this stuff together, and that's going to be a little tricky. So I'm going to try and do that as best I can. Okay, so episode 2 comes out, and we meet Jango Fett, and we see that Jango is the key to the clone army for the Republic, and we, just like when we see Boba Fett, we assume that Jango is also a Mandalorian. At this time, Lucasfilm is still in charge of Lucasfilm. There's no Disney overlords at this point. There is a entire canon, an entire history of expanded universe materials that support this history that existed prior to the prequel movies being released. So, seeing Jango Fett, finding out that Boba Fett is a clone of Jango, throws a little bit of a monkey wrench into things, but we still are led to believe that there is that Jango and Boba, by extension, are Mandalorians. And the series that I referenced prior to this episode, way back when, and I think it was the first episode of The Mandalorian that I mentioned, the Karen Travis series, plays up to this fact. They sort of highlight the fact that Jango is something of an exile from the main Mandalorian culture. He was born on a planet Concord Dawn, a planet within a moon of the Mandalorian system, I do believe, and thus he is a Mandalorian by that extent, but not so much in the sense of being born on Mandalore. Now, we've talked about this. Is Mandalore people? Is Mandalore culture? At this point in the Star Wars universe, we don't know. A couple years later, we find out that Mandalore is much more of a culture, much more of a way of living, a way of life, as opposed to being born into blood, being born on a planet, as it were. But like I said, Jango's a bit of an exile. He doesn't buy into their ways. He goes off and becomes a bounty hunter. And by extension, his son/clone, Boba, is much the same way. After Jango's death, Boba follows the path that his father laid before him. He doesn't go running back to Mandalore. He does not go back to join one of the clans. And that is where we start running into a little trouble. In that Karen Travis series, where she chronicles the clones from escaping their time in the clone army to becoming full-fledged Mandalores, we find out that Boba Fett is something of a wayward son amongst the Mandalores, and eventually he will become. He comes back to the fold. He's brought back into the fold of the Mandalorians, eventually to rise to the title, the head position of the Mandalore, where he is the head of the clans. Except the bad news is that, Disney bought Star Wars, and they wipe all of this out. Now, before you go thinking that this is a Disney thing and this is all Disney's fault, it's actually not. According to several interviews with Dave Filoni and George Lucas himself, and for the record, in case anyone was unclear, Dave Filoni is essentially George Lucas's protege. When Dave Filoni was getting the Clone Wars series off the ground, there was a ton of input coming in from George Lucas about what he wanted certain things to be like, because I think they viewed the Clone Wars as a way to kind of set the record straight on certain aspects of the Star Wars universe, which is 100% George Lucas's prerogative. You know, as much as I love that Karen Travis series with Boba Fett and the Mandalorians and everything that she created and brought to the Star Wars universe, and as upset as I was that it was just so casually swept to the side, it it's still George Lucas's story, in my opinion, for better or for worse. And if he's like, no, that's not how it's supposed to be, I sort of kind of have to defer to the guy because it is his creation after all. So Disney buys Lucasfilm. They sweep that old continuity away, and our again, what I've mentioned before, our first big indication of what Star Wars canon is going to be is that Star Wars Rebel show that now, I'm sorry, not Rebels, Star Wars Clone Wars, which you can now find on Disney Plus. If you're watching The Mandalorian, you might as well watch Star Wars The Clone Wars, and you can find all this stuff out and watch these episodes. And they do quite a number of things to show us that Jango was, and Boba Fett is, very far removed from Mandalore, and not to be considered Mandalorians. Now, there's a lot of hints and a lot of vagueness still, but the main implication is that Jango Fett basically stole his armor. And, by extension, when the time comes and Boba Fett's a fully grown adult male, he steals his armor as well. Or at the very least, they both have forged their own that is identical in look to the traditional Mandalorian armor. Now, I've done a little deep dive into some of the Star Wars archives material for what is considered canon and what is not, and there are some inconsistencies in those articles that I read. One of the big main inconsistencies is that all Mandalorian armor is made from Beskar. That doesn't seem to jive with A, what we've seen on The Mandalorian, but B, what we also can probably infer from the events of The Mandalorian and a little bit of continuity that we gleaned from Star Wars The Clone Wars and from Star Wars Rebels. The Imperial occupation would have prevented the mining of Beskar for Mandalorians. They would have been taking that material for themselves. So any Mandalorian who wants to forge their own armor is doing it from material that is less than Beskar, which is what Boba Fett and Jango Fett's armors are made from. They are made from Durasteel, which is still a very strong metal, but as you've noticed from Boba Fett, I mean, his armor is battle tested, and it shows especially on the chest piece and the big dent on the left side of his helmet. According to obviously according to Star Wars lore, Beskar would not take that kind of damage. It would repel all that damage. Durasteel is still very, very strong, and obviously much stronger than the Stormtrooper armor. Who, I mean, I don't even know why they bother. Those guys just get blasted right through the chest, and it's over. Hope you had fun wearing that white stupid armor, dum-dums. So it gets a little tricky. Like I said, this is all a little complicated. It's a little much. So Jango and Boba, by extension, are sort of Mandalorian pretenders, according to the current canon of the Star Wars universe. Did they kill and steal armor? Did they forge their own armor? It's unclear at this point. It seems to be what they're trying to do is they're trying to play up the fact that, listen, here on this Mandalorian show, we're showing you the true way of the Mandalores. And it does kind of jive with what we've seen from Clone Wars and from Rebels, with the exception of the helmet removal. They all freely remove their helmets on Clone Wars and Rebels. Sorry, that's just a fact. What I do think this does is, while it does separate Boba Fett from the Mandalorian legacy that we assumed he had, it does kind of put his Boba Fett's code into a better context when compared to what we've seen from our Mando on The Mandalorian. Our Mando does seem to have a higher code of ethics over profit, over money. He seems to be bettering the situation for his people. Boba Fett is clearly a man about his reputation, his bank account, and just being a general badass overall, answering to no one except himself. And I think that leads to an interesting situations, particularly in light of the way the last episode of The Mandalorian ended, with the mysterious cape, the mysterious boots on the ground, looking at the body of Fennec Shand. Is this going to be the chance where will this be the time where we see a post Return of the Jedi Boba Fett enter the fray, and we start to find out just how different he is from the Mandalorian that we've gotten to know over these last five episodes? It seems like really rich ground to explore, because, I mean, let's be honest. Like I said at the beginning of the show, the reason why so many of us are interested in the Mandalorians in general is because of Boba Fett, who's not even a Mandalorian by the definitions established in the new canon. So it will be interesting to see how our Mando reacts to Boba Fett and how Boba Fett treats that Mandalorian. Is he really not part of their culture? Again, even in canon, Jango Fett was part of the Mandalorian star system on a planet of which they were inhabitants, but apparently not part of the main crew. So it's again, we've talked about on previous episodes reviewing The Mandalorian. We need to start getting some better answers, because at least from my perspective as someone who knows the old and someone who knows the new, it would be nice to get some clarification on certain points for the series, for the characters in general. It's funny. I kind of, for a long time, I rubbed up against the notion that Boba Fett was not a Mandalorian. That really bugged me. And I think for a long time it was because I really enjoyed the expanded universe canon, where they kind of brought him back to the fold. And he was, like I said, he was sort of this wayward child of Mandalore who eventually came back to Mandalore to help them rise up and to kind of regain status in the Star Wars galaxy. I did really, really like that aspect of the character. But that version of the character had an intrinsic root, an intrinsic tie to the culture. This new canon, this post Disney canon, doesn't seem to be a thing for Boba Fett. It does not seem to be part of his makeup. He seems to be, again, he's fueled by the loss of his father and the desire to be like his father. His father, Jango, was reputed to be the most well-known, most lethal, most dangerous bounty hunter in the galaxy, and that's what Boba wants for himself. So he's very into Boba. Boba's for Boba. I get that. It makes a certain amount of sense for a bounty hunter character to be of that kind of even grayer morality than what we've seen on this show previously. So what does it mean for what's going to go forward? I don't know, because we don't know if that's actually what's going to happen on The Mandalorian. This is all speculation on our parts as fans, which has been one of the fun parts of the show. It's like, you know what? It would be kind of cool to see our Mando square off against Boba Fett. Though, to be perfectly frank, I've talked about it on the show previously. I've not been all that impressed by some of our Mandalorian's decision-making and his combat prowess. I think Boba Fett might hand him his ass. But then again, Boba Fett also got a gaffy stick to the back of his rocket pack, slammed into the side of a sail barge, and fell into a sarlacc pit. So what the fuck do I know about Boba Fett's fighting prowess? I don't. But I wanted to come on the show and do the special little supplemental because like I said, it's ironic that so many Star Wars fans are fueled by the notion, the idea of what a Mandalorian is because of Boba Fett. And according to George Lucas, according to Dave Filoni, and according to the new canon, which is established post-Disney, he's not. Not even close. They have completely distanced themselves from Boba Fett. Even the notion that Boba Fett's even casually connected to the Mandalore people, the Mandalore culture. And it makes for an interesting conundrum to kind of see how they're going to crack that nut, if that's what they're even doing. Again, this is an entire podcast episode that's based on pure speculation, which is not something I do often. But I felt that in this instance, it bared a little further exploration. And again, as someone who is a big Boba Fett fan, I cannot hide my love for Boba Fett. In my little man cave room, I have a autographed Boba Fett 8x10 signed by Jeremy Bulloch, the actor who was in the suit for Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. I have been a big fan for a long time of Boba Fett. I have his original Kenner action figure on my bookshelf. But yeah, it was a. I think for a long time I was kind of in denial about the fact that they were changing the history and making him not a Mandalorian because, as I said, those Karen Travis novels, they're spectacular. Their exploration of Boba Fett, his legacy, his history, are fantastic. And she did a killer job of reconnecting the Star Wars base with kind of like their fallen hero, because for some reason Boba Fett didn't get a ton of exposure in the expanded universe canon. But maybe that's just because they were waiting for the right writer to come along and tell the tales of Boba Fett and his rise within the Mandalorian culture, his rise to the head, to being the Mandalore, to uniting the clans, retaking the planet, the discovery of the new Beskar mines, the new Beskar veins on Mandalore that helped them rise to prominence again, and then Boba Fett's own personal backstory, where you find out about his failed relationships, the daughter that he never knew, and then the granddaughter who would track him down and attempt to kill him at a certain point. These were fantastic stories, and I'm not gonna lie, I was a little bummed when they were just tossed aside like so much unwanted refuse. It was a hard pill for me to swallow because I was very invested in that story, and as I mentioned before, when we talked about that story, that series never even got a proper ending because of the Disney deal. So we never even really know how those characters, Boba included, were to wind up because we just never got there, and it was a real bummer. But slowly but surely, like we talked about too, elements of that old continuity are starting to creep into the new Star Wars continuity. So maybe there will be some carryover. Maybe there will be more ground to play on that is familiar to a person like me who's read all these books, who grew up reading all these books, and invested countless rides on the DC Metro, just sitting there reading page after page of these Star Wars stories. I don't know for sure. They seem to be doing a nice job of cherry picking the right moments of the old continuity to bring into the new continuity. We'll see what they do here. We will see. And if it does pan out that our Mando on The Mandalorian is going to have to face off against Boba Fett, he's going to have his hands full. I have no doubt about that. Again, I would be a little surprised if it did turn out to be Boba Fett, at least at this point in the series. It does seem early. But perhaps they're setting up what the main crux of season 2 will be by this. Maybe we don't actually see Boba Fett until the end, until like the final shot of season 1 or something along those lines. It's hard to say for sure with any kind of confidence at this point. But it'd be good news. It would be good news. Again, if I were to have one main complaint about this about The Mandalorian in general as a show, is that the plot is a little light. Bring in some Boba Fett. Bring in some stuff that could add some complexity, some more layers to the story, as opposed to just like, we're gonna hop from planet to planet this week and try to keep Baby Yoda safe. It's like watching episodes of The Incredible Hulk all over again. It's just like, oh, Bruce Banner's going from town to town, and luckily in the last 10 minutes, the Hulk will show up to save the day. Okay, it's not quite that thin, but you know what I mean. A little bit more depth, a little bit more complexity is not going to be a bad thing for the show. Adding a character like Boba Fett, especially as like a recurring kind of, I don't want to say villain necessarily, but as a force, could be a nice thing. Could be a nice welcome change to the dynamic of the show. Especially if they decide to play up any kind of, Mandalorian connection, or whether the Mandalorian's like offended by Boba Fett, a pretender who's wearing their armor, or perhaps he knows whose armor he stole, or is just, there's avenues to go down. There's a lot of storytelling potential here, and I'd love to see them kind of play that up if they do happen to bring back the Fett. And as we've established, we're all fans of the Fett on this podcast. I feel like I covered the main points I wanted to talk about. So I think we're going to end up wrapping up this little mini Boba Fett debate episode of the Tomcast Popcast, the Boba Fett debate edition. Feel free to hit me up with your thoughts. You can follow the show on social media and DM me, at me, bro, at Tomcast_Popcast on Twitter, at the Tomcast_Popcast on Instagram. You can email TomcastPopcast@gmail.com. Hey, join us on Pophead Nation too, patreon.com/TomcastPopcast. And, subscribe. Make sure you're subscribing to the show. Tell your friends about us. 5-star reviews, all that good stuff. It goes a long way. Helps us all out a ton. Big shout out to my current Patreons, the Aspinall Chody and Brian Broussard, the Squid Master General himself. Brian was probably expecting me to drop the Watchmen episode, but I wanted to do this first because of all my technical difficulties with the show today. I felt like I could knock out the Boba Fett episode a little bit faster. So the Watchmen episode will be dropping by the end of the week. I promise. All right, so with that in mind, Boba Fett, not a Mandalorian. Our Mando is a Mandalorian. And maybe they're on a collision course. Maybe they are on a collision course for each other. And Baby Yoda is in the middle. But Baby Yoda is Baby Yoda. And Baby Yoda is all. Baby Yoda is everything. He is the Alpha. He is the Omega. And with that, this is the Tomcast Popcast. My name is Tom. Ciao, babes.
He's no good to me dead.
Hey, so there it is. That is the Boba Fett debate from my original podcast back in January of last year, where we sort of explored the old canon versus the new canon and where Boba Fett stands in it, which I think we can all agree is not a lot known about where he stands, as we sort of speculated in last week's episode when we revisited the Gunslinger episode. Is the character at the end of that episode who comes across the body of Fennec Shand, is that Boba Fett, or is it the character who is alluded to in the Star Wars Aftermath novels, the Cobb Vanth character, who, rumors again, will be played by Timothy Olyphant in season 2 of The Mandalorian. We just don't know, but rumors also continue to swirl that Tamora Morrison is coming back to reprise the role of Boba Fett in season 2 of The Mandalorian. So is that who we saw in the boots and the cape? Who's to say? I suspect if Boba Fett's old continuity has anything to do with where he stands now, I bet it wouldn't be I wouldn't be too surprised to see if it stays mysterious and a little complicated, as we sort of talked about the Jodo Cast character who existed for a while and who sort of became a scapegoat for a sort of buffoonish Boba Fett. and he turned out, according to the real Boba Fett, he was simply an imposter, and Boba Fett did away with him so that he could resume his badass ways and become the legendary bounty hunter that we all know and love. And again, I need to emphasize something that I don't think I talked about too much in the first episode. Is I am a Boba Fett fanatic. This was a character that I became completely obsessed with after, more specifically in my teenage years. The Star Wars trilogy, the original ones, 4, 5, and 6, had been on VHS for a while. They had been out. I had seen all of them 7,000 times by this point. And Boba Fett was sort of like this dark character living in the gray of the Star Wars universe, and that is, in the Star Wars underworld that Han Solo was part of, that Jabba the Hutt was part of, and again, the armor, the helmet, the T-visor, that is the logo of this podcast. It was all so cool and just struck such a chord with me that I became completely obsessed with anything Mandalorian, Boba Fett related. Boba Fett, maybe not a Mandalorian, in the new canon. I guess we'll have to see how that's explored. But that's what kind of got me interested in the Mandalorians to begin with, was Boba Fett. He was sort of that entry point into these people. And Boba Fett was the entry point for me into exploring more of the Star Wars universe, whether it was in the role-playing games or in the comic books and stuff like that. Like when I was reading that Star Wars the Dark Horse comic book series, Dark Empire, and I think it was issue 4, and you see Boba Fett's on the cover, so it kind of spoils the surprise on the inside. But when Han and Leia and Chewbacca encounter Boba Fett for the first time in that comic book, and they're like, "Wait, we thought you were dead," and he quips, that the Sarlacc found him somewhat indigestible. That's the stuff that like resonated with a teenage Tom, and really sunk its teeth into me, and I became and still am a big fan of Boba Fett. But again, as I also insinuated, I'm not alone in that. There's millions of us who are obsessed with Boba Fett, and Boba Fett again was our entry point into the Mandalorians, into wanting to explore and know more about that culture, about that people. And, perhaps like myself, people were a bit jilted when Disney swept in and brushed aside that expanded universe canon that we all became so deeply in love with. Or perhaps we weren't in love with it, so we were glad when it was swept away. But again, that was information that was kind of sustaining us for a really long time. And it got us to where we are. It got us fans excited about Star Wars in a way, and about a character who was sort of tertiary. I mean, and that's even a bit generous for a character whose screen time was probably less than 10 minutes across 3 movies until the prequels, which again he features more prominently in, but not in the way that a lot of us hardcore nerds were led to believe initially, of the role of the Mandalorians in the Clone Wars and their battles against the Jedi and the Republic. But again, that's George Lucas's prerogative. It's his story, and that's totally fine. If the role the Mandalorians have to play is that they're the basis of the clone army for the Republic, okay, cool. I'm okay with that too. Again, we got so many great stories, so many exciting adventures out of that it was totally worth it. Totally worth it. And I guess this episode is really just a long-winded way of saying that we don't really know where we are with Boba Fett in the new canon. But it seems like, if the rumors are to be believed, whether it's through Timothy Olyphant as Cobb Vanth, as another Boba Fett imposter in his armor, whether it's Tamara Morrison, Jesus, returning as Boba Fett, actually to play Boba Fett for the first time. To be perfectly honest, I know he does the voiceovers in the re-edits of the original trilogy, but I believe this would be the first time donning the Boba Fett armor as opposed to when he donned the Jango Fett armor in Attack of the Clones. It looks like we're going to start to get some answers about where Boba's been, what Boba's doing, his connection to the Mandalorians, his connection to the Mandalorian, to Din Djarin, if there is one, connection to the armorer. I mean, the whole thing is it's just green with potential. It's so ripe that you just want to bite into it, because that is a juicy, juicy melon to be explored and to be savored by Star Wars fans, and particularly fans like myself who are fans of Boba Fett, fans of the Fett, fans of the Mandalorians, fans of the Mandalorian culture. All of us bucketheads I think we have a lot to look forward to on season 2 of the Mandalorian. And as you've listened to me reviewing these early episodes of season 1 of the Mandalorian, one of my gripes was that it's a little light. There's not a great amount of depth to some of the stories. Again, looking back now, you can tell that's done by design. You can tell that's done to be an entry point for new fans. And Star Wars should always be accessible to new fans. And I think that was something that I was aware of, but I don't think I was quite processing as I was reviewing the shows initially. Star Wars always needs to be accessible for a new generation. That's how Star Wars is going to live forever. It's how it's going to live past all of us. Is by always having new fans come on board. By always being able to be accessible to new fans. Where you don't have to be inundated with 30, 40 years of past history. That's probably the biggest blessing of Disney coming aboard and wiping away that old continuity. Maybe it bothered me and a bunch of people my age, but it's simplified Star Wars in a dramatic way for new generations of fans to come in, watch the movies, watch the new series that will be on Disney Plus, and explore the comic books and the new novels that were coming out. And you've noticed the novels come out much fewer. There's much more space between them. It's much more approachable, easy to digest, and they play around with the eras, which is also important too. So you can kind of pick your favorite era of Star Wars and focus on that if you want. Again, I'm just kind of rambling now at this point because it's Star Wars. It's my favorite thing in the world, around the world. I love me that Star Wars, and the sweet Mandalorians, and in particular, again, Boba Fett. I have an 8x10 signed by Jeremy Bulloch on the wall, right by my little recording area here in the Tom Cave. And again, I can't emphasize enough how much Boba Fett means to me, how much the Mandalorians mean to me, which is why I do this podcast. So hopefully this has provided a little bit of illumination for anyone curious about Boba Fett and his stance in this new canon, like where we might find Boba Fett. And odds are we're going to find him probably roughly where we left him, which is somewhere on Tatooine after being spit out of the Sarlacc pit. And I can't wait to see where we pick up from there. And I can't wait to see how we integrate him into the Mandalorian story. Is he friend, foe, nemesis, neither, either, both? I can't wait to find out. I've been singing the praises of Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni for a long time. And I suspect I will continue to do so unless they do something just completely egregious in season 2. But the odds of that are very, very slim. All right, so with that, I'm going to wrap it up because, like I said, I think I've talked almost more in the opening and closing segments than I did in the entire middle podcast, which was recorded back in December, for God's sake. So that being said, I want to thank everyone for listening to this small independent Star Wars podcast that we call Mando Vision. We are part of the 3BZ network of podcasts. You can also listen to me on the Tomcast podcast, which covers a wide swath of the pop culture world, and our primary show, Beer Night in San Diego, covering the San Diego beer scene and all the goodies that come along with that. Please take a time to check us out and give us support and love, and follow this show on the social media, Mando_Vision on Twitter and Instagram. If you need to email me, do so at tomcastpopcast@gmail.com. I'm keeping just one email. I can't have 47 email addresses. It's just not going to work out for me. I only check a couple of them at a time. Anyways, I hope everyone stays safe. I hope everyone's had a great weekend. And we're into October now. The countdown has begun to season 2 of The Mandalorian. So we're going to close out the show as we always close out the show. So remember, this is the way.
Thank you for meeting with me, Prime Minister Almec.
I welcome you as a servant of the people, but I am troubled by the false rumors that brought you here. Mandalore would never turn against the Republic. The Duchess Satine values peace more than her own life.
Oh, I'm aware of the Duchess's views.
Master Kenobi, Mandalore's violent past is behind us. All of our warriors were exiled to our moon, Concordia. They died out years ago.
Are you certain? I recently encountered a man who wore Mandalorian armor. Jango Fett.
Jango Fett was a common bounty hunter. How he acquired that armor is beyond me.